A very warm welcome to all of our listeners. We're back again with another exciting episode of The Bigger Picture, EcoSpa's very own podcast, where we talk to renowned experts in the field of economics about various social, political, and economic issues of importance. I, Mihika, along with Chitanjay, will be your hosts for today.
So today we have with us Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg. He was a 1983 batch IS officer of Rajasthan cadre. He served as the Economic Affairs Secretary and Finance Secretary of India from 2017 to 2019. He has also served as an Executive Director in the World Bank. Mr. Garg has graduate degrees in Law and Commerce from Rajasthan University and from Government College Ajmer. Mr. Garg is a professionally qualified cost and management accountant. In addition, Mr. Garg is a qualified company secretary and also received a gold medal in the year 1990. So we can begin with the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Please go ahead. Thank you very much for the introduction.
So we'll be discussing the budget 2022 on this podcast and its social and political and economic effects on the society. So the very first question is quite a general one. So what is your opinion on the overall budget and the fiscal deficit pegged at 6.4% of the GDP?
So the budget, when it's presented on the 1st of February of every year, is basically the budget review, or what we call revised budget for the current year, which is currently going on. So that's 21-22. And also the estimates which are presented for the next year, that is 22-23. So this budget was made, formulated, and presented in the background of the COVID-19. We had a very bad situation in wave second last year, so that had its own implications. The economy had recovered quite a good deal in the second half. There were also good sort of response on corporate taxes and the excise duty which the government had increased. So there was good momentum on the revenue side, but the government's expenditure commitments had also increased substantially. The food subsidy bill had increased by about 1 lakh crore. The Narega outgo has gone up. The fertilizer subsidy had gone up. So on net, the 21-22 budget was on the whole more or less like in terms of the fiscal deficit as it was presented. So 6.9%. In fact, it was slightly higher than the budget when it was presented. For 22-23, as you also noted, the fiscal deficit of 6.4% came up. The government was somewhat conservative on the estimates of the revenue side for the next year. There was hardly an increase of about 9 to 10%. The government also probably played safe in keeping the expenditures lower for the next year. But the implications of very high fiscal deficit and the debt burden was played in the form of higher interest rates. So if you would see the difference between the 22-23 and 21-22 budget, which is a rise of about, or increase of about 2 lakh crores, about 75% of that goes only in paying the interest. So my overall sense of the budget 22-23 is that this is a kind of pragmatic budget made in the face of the improving situation on the economy, but still not the economy seemed to be having the full dynamism, full flow of its potential. So on the whole, a conservative. On the policy side, the budget was quite weak this time. There was not much of the policy announcements. In fact, even continuation of the policies announced last year, like the privatization of banks, etc., the monetization program, were not sort of highlighted much. So on the whole, a budget which is reasonably decent, but not a path-breaking kind of budget.
All right. Moving on to the next question. Could they have been more expansionary by financing the additional borrowing through printing money? Though it poses a risk of inflation, should it be fine given the output gap?
Now, I think the sense I got from your earlier question was that you are looking to the budget to be a little more conservative, consolidation of debt and things like that. Whereas this question of yours is on the other side, that why can't we be more expansionary and given the inflationary situation developing in the economy, can we not sort of take care of poor by sort of generating more demand by putting more money into their hands? So these are the two different viewpoints in a way, which you would see different groups articulating. One would like the consolidation of debt, the government expenditures to be contained, and the other one would like the expansion to take place, especially the expansion in two areas. One, which is to put more money into the hands of poor who also suffered in the pandemic. The demand is still less than what the demand was in the pre-pandemic period, and therefore that kind of adequacy. But there is always a danger. We already reached a very high level of debt. If you expand too much, then even when there is an output gap, and there is output gap in the economy, because if you would see the capacity utilization, still it is around 70%. And therefore, it is expected that if you provide more money into the hands of poor, which generates the demand for those kind of goods and services, there might be expansion of economy, but it's a risky strategy.
All right, sir. So now if we talk about the performance on the revenue side, though the center has posted like tax revenues in the past years, some really buoyant ones, it hasn't created much additional space. Mr. Ratan Roy recently asserted that the total budget expenditure has actually declined as compared to last year. So were the tax collections sufficient enough?
Let me give you an overall sense of the budget balance before we see whether the question of the expenditures being compressed or the government didn't do enough or not. If you see the 22-23 budget, the size is about 39.4 lakh crores, right? Of that, the two main components, the taxation side, which is where your question is, the taxation contributes something close to about 20 lakh crores, right? And the debt is about 16.5 lakh crores. The rest, 2 to 3 lakh crores, is non-tax incomes and the disinvestment revenues, right? So the tax growth to 20 lakh crores from the 18 odd lakh crores of 21-22, as I said earlier, also was by many people rated as conservative. Now, if you go into a little deeper into it, there are certain dynamics of the tax revenues which need to be kept in mind. One of the major taxation source which has been generating lots of revenues for the government is the excise revenue, right? So in 22-23, it is expected to provide about 3.3 lakh crores or so. And in 21-22, it was little less than 4 lakh crores. Whereas earlier, this was not even exceeding 2 lakh crores. The government had increased the excise duties in May 2020 after there was a crash in the petroleum prices globally, and which had given lots of revenues to the government. But by the time we were, I think the time for the presentation of budget 20 to 23 came, the situation had changed dramatically, so to say, which has changed much more after the budget has been presented. Thanks to the conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere, the oil prices have crossed $100 a barrel. And whereas the government said that even the budget preparation, they had assumed $75, and earlier it was much less. So there is already lots of talk about the government being under pressure to reduce excise duty, because today, thanks to elections which are taking place, the oil companies have not increased the oil prices, the petrol and the diesel prices for last over 120 days. The moment the elections are over, there would be no option but to increase, and that increase would be of the order of about 13 to 15 rupees a liter if the government doesn't adjust the excise duties. So in most likelihood, the government would bring down the excise duties to some extent, maybe 5 rupees, maybe 7 rupees, maybe 10 rupees. Because even then the petrol prices and the diesel prices would rise to accommodate the entire thing. So by no means the government is likely to keep getting this kind of high revenues next year. Likewise, you would see that there is now a kind of plateau on the corporate income side. So corporation tax, which had gone and grown quite substantially in the year 21-22, is unlikely to grow that way in 22-23. Personal income tax may stay the course, but the other two major sources of taxation are unlikely to yield that kind. So the government couldn't have possibly taken a more optimistic view on the revenue side. Now, if you want to expand expenditures, right, then you will have to raise debt. Now, you're already raising debt, which was budgeted at 6.4% of GDP, or about 16.5 lakh crores rupees. Now, that's a very high level of fiscal deficit. Our normal debt bearing capacity is about 3 to 3.5%, not 6.5%. And before the pandemic, the government was always trying to keep the fiscal deficit below 3.5%. Their aim was to bring it to 3%. Now, therefore, you can't expand the expenditures at the cost of raising the debt or the fiscal deficit to such a high level. So I don't think what Rathin said was really a good choice for the government.
All right. Moving on to the next question. Why is it that the government has sharply revised its disinvestment targets downwards? That is close to 60%. Is it an admission of defeat by the Revenue Department? What bottlenecks are they facing on the privatization side?
So first, a small correction. The disinvestment program is not handled by the Revenue Department. There is a department called DIPAM, Department of Investment and the Asset Management, which handles the disinvestment and the privatization program of the government. But that's a small thing. This is a fact that the government revised sharply downward. Once again, in the previous 2 years, also the government had revised the disinvestment target substantially. Last year, it was 2.1 lakh crores, which was revised to only 32,000 crores or something. In the budget this year also, they have revised from 1.75 lakh crores to 75,000 crores this year, 78,000 crores this year. And for the next year, they have kept it only at 65,000. My sense is that the reality of the inability of the government to do privatization is actually sinking in the government that it's not in a position to really make the privatization. If you would remember last year budget, the government was very gung-ho about saying that we will privatize 2 banks, we will privatize the one insurance company, we'll also do BPCL and the Shipping Corporation of India, IDBI Bank, and many other privatization in the year. But the year 21-22 is about to end. And in this year, the government has been able to do only one privatization, which is the Air India. And the Air India privatization also did not yield anything notable for the government. In fact, it has left lots of losses, debts and write-offs, which the government will have to do. It's good in the sense that the annual losses of about 7,000 to 10,000 crores will not be on the government's account any longer, but the government had to write off about 55,000 crores of equity and had also to take over the debt of about 80,000 to 90,000 crores on its own balance sheet to get the Air India off. And that one transaction consumed lots of energies and the capacity of the government. And this year, so far, the disinvestment revenues are not even 15,000 crores. The government is banking only on the LIC disinvestment. And there is, I guess you are all aware that there is a difference between privatization and the disinvestment. In disinvestment, you're not selling the company, you're selling some shares of it. And the LIC issue is where the government is banking to raise about 60,000 to 65,000 crores. If the LIC issue does not go through this year, for whatever reasons, then the government would not be able to even collect 25,000 crores this year against the sharply revised target of the 78,000 crores. So disinvestment and privatization especially, has proved to be a tough business for the government.
All right, sir. So my next question is again related to the revenue and the capital expenditure. The government has prioritized the capital expenditure over the revenue expenditure to support the growth. However, with the low credit growth and the low rates of private investment, will it be enough to give a push to the total capital formation as of now?
I think number one, let us be clear that what do we mean by prioritization of the capital expenditure? Of the 39.5 lakh crores of the budget, the capex is only 7.5 lakh crores as projected by the rest 32 lakh crores is revenue expenditure. The increase in interest payments is 1.5 lakh crores, right? So it's not prioritization in that sense. But I understand there is a lot of talk. The finance minister was also at pains to explain in the budget speech, saying that we are increasing the capex by about 2 lakh crores or 34.5% over the previous year's budgeted capex. And that is where a lot of media and others also picked up that story, that the capex is being increased substantially. But if you go a little deeper into this as well, you would find that that story is not actually true. For your information, the capex of the central government takes place from two broad heads. One is where the central government, from its own budget, incur capital expenditure, right? So if the government, let us say, buys defense equipments, or government spends on roads, or government expends on railways, or on metro, or on buildings, that's the government's capex from the government's own budget. but much more economic related or the growth related or infrastructure related expenditures or capex takes place in the central public sector undertakings of the government. The likes of the Power Grid, NTPC, Indian Oil Corporation, ONGC, and the like. And the government presents the budget estimates for both in its own budget. So if you care to read the statement number 1 of the budget profile, the government gives you that from the budget, central government budget cell, we'll incur this much, and the central public undertakings capital expenditure, which is called internal and extra budgetary resources for the capex, will be this much. And together they are the total expenditure of the or the total capex of the government sector or the central government sector, as we may put it. So if you look carefully, these two items, so this time what the government did was that it increased the allocation for the road sector. So NHAI has been given about 65,000 to 70,000 crores extra. There is another company of the government called BSNL, which has been given about 40,000 crores equity. So about 1.2 lakh crores of expenditure has been increased on the capex side by increasing the allocation to the two companies only, the NHAI and the BSNL. But what the government has done or what has happened is that the NHAI has reduced its own resources for capex. So NHAI, which used to raise bonds and resources from the market for the year 22-23, NHAI will not be doing so. Likewise, the BSNL would depend entirely on the government support. So on net basis, in about 1.2 lakh crores of expenditure has been reduced on the public sector side. There is one more kind of, I wouldn't say this sleet of hand or something, but the government started a practice that they will provide, the central government will provide loans to the state governments, right? And for capex. So this year for 22-23, a budget of 1 lakh crore has been proposed as loans to the state governments. Now that capex is not of the central government, that is a capex of the state governments. Secondly, the state governments have a defined sort of bouquet or bucket of the total capex, which by which they can raise from the market by way of loans and all. So instead of taking loan from the market, they will take 1 lakh crore from the central government. Their total expenditure remains unchanged. So if you exclude this 1 lakh crores also, which is being given to the states, actually there is a reduction of about 15 to 20,000 crores in the capex. So capex, I don't think has received, if you look at the total thing, a kind of priority as has been claimed.
Okay, moving on. Since you briefly mentioned personal income tax earlier, among a host of significant announcements, the decision to tax receivers of digital assets transferred at a high 30%, and that got some serious attention. There, however, were remarkably very few changes to the personal income tax structure. So what is your opinion on the same?
So the personal income tax structure, I think there are two major problems with the current structure. Number one, there are too many rates. And there is too high a kind of rate and too lower a kind of minimum exemption. So there was expectation that the rate structure would be reformed and the maximum rates may be sort of rationalized and the minimum rates would also be perhaps increased. So nothing of that sort of happened, and that is why there was some sort of disappointment in the households and the salary earners in that community that they did not give. But a proposal was brought on the crypto side. So the digital assets, virtual digital assets, as you referred, the VDAs. Over last couple of years, there's been tremendous interest, especially in the young people, the millennials, about the fancy which it has taken for the crypto assets kind of thing. Crypto assets, the government thought, by the way, any asset you make profits or capital gains is subject to tax. You don't have to tell specifically that there is a tax on building, or there is a tax on this, or there is a tax on equities, there is on hybrid instruments, or whatever. There are broad categories under which the capital gains is taxable for all kind of assets. So the crypto assets also were subject to tax, but the capital gains attracts different rates of taxation in the country. So equities long-term gets taxed at 10%, short-term gets at 15-20%, unlisted shares get taxed at 45%, or something of the, so there is that. So this had created lots of confusion in the minds of both investors as well as the tax authorities, that what is the rate at which you tax the capital gains on the crypto assets. So the government clarified and said that we will have 30% tax on the gains related to crypto assets, or the VDAs. VDA definition, by the way, is wider than crypto. So even the digital assets created on the non-blockchain and cryptography platforms, or the centralized database platforms, can also be subjected to this tax. That will play out as we go along. So they fix the 30% taxation on the crypto assets, capital gains. Now, there are lots of people who say that this is very high rates. If you tax equity at 10 to 20%, why are you treating this? And the other thing which the government also did was that no other deduction was allowed except the cost of acquisition. Loss set-off was also not allowed. So there is that kind of thing. But I take it this way, that this brought an initial clarity that yes, the crypto assets capital gains are taxable and you have to pay 30% tax. Now there might be engagement as you go along, and there might be some adjustment as we move forward. So I don't consider this 30% taxation on crypto capital gains as the final thing or the last word. In times to come, perhaps there would be clarity. The problematic or more problematic provisions in my judgment was the 1% TDS. That was to be sort of deducted by the purchaser from before the payment is made to the seller. There are confusion relating to that. If you sort of buy from a resident seller, an Indian resident seller, then you have to deduct this 1%. But if you buy it from a foreign seller, you don't have to. Likewise, there is also confusion relating to the way people will have to sort of register with the tax authorities. When do you deduct? The transactions are instantaneous, but the deduction cannot be made like that. And what is the role of the exchanges in this? So lots of confusion regarding 1%. So I think government would have to do a little more or lot more clarity on this front going forward. I think the VDA assets taxation is a good initial movement, as I said earlier, but there are still also lots of areas of crypto businesses which are outside the, for example, if you produce some goods and service on the crypto platforms like digital finance, or you create NFTs, or you build some programs, those are the subjects of indirect taxation, the GST. But there is no clarity as yet that what is the GST to be charged on this kind of thing, what is subject to GST and what is not subject to GST. So I think as it has been done in the case of capital gains taxation, in times to come on mining for others, those business related services and the goods which we produce, I think on that the government should also come out with its own taxation proposals or taxation regime.
All right, sir. So my final question is a very small question based on this only, the 30% taxation on the cryptocurrencies. So with this taxation on the cryptocurrency, does it de facto imply that the government of India is legalizing the cryptocurrency?
See, I think this question also has come up very often, and I think people are struggling to sort of get a sense that there many times statements are made that by taxing it's not legalizing. There are also lots of noises made that cryptocurrencies would be banned and things like that. And therefore, this question is quite legitimate in the minds of everyone. Now, I would suggest you go by the law of the land. There is no law in the country which says today that the crypto businesses and trading in the crypto assets is illegal. And by interpretation of the law, unless something is specifically declared to be illegal or banned, that is not considered to be legally banned or illegal, right? So in the absence of any law in the country on this front, banning anything which is, you ban gambling, you ban prostitution, whatever. So, but that would require a specific law. There is no law in the country which bans the crypto businesses and the crypto assets holding or trading or whatever, right? And therefore, in my judgment, there is no ban. There should not be any doubt in the minds of anyone that this is not legal. Or secondly, even when some of the authorities like RBI tried to do it in 2018-19, by excluding the banking and the payment system from being used for buying and selling the cryptocurrencies. Even that circular of the Reserve Bank was held ultra vires and illegal by the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court did say that until and unless the government decides to make a proactive, clear law taking a view that this is not to be allowed, this is a perfectly legitimate business under the Constitution. Then the right to do business is a fundamental right. So I think I have no doubt in my mind that at this moment, until the government comes up with something, the crypto or the VDA related businesses as well as assets are perfectly legitimate.
All right, so with this, we come to an end for another episode of The Bigger Picture. And we really want to thank Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, our speaker for the session, who have joined us, taking time out of his busy schedule. And any student who loves to read about macroeconomics and the Indian macroeconomic situation would really find this podcast really intriguing because of the greater insights about the budget, the fiscal consolidations, and the ideas of how the expenditures are taken in the government sector, coming all the way from a person who has worked in the sector for so many years. So we would like to thank you again, sir, on the behalf of the Economic Society of Shahid Bhagat Singh College.